So by the time more people come in and also Sai Deepak ji joins us, let me start with a brief introduction of what we do here at the Indology Club. So, I'd like to welcome you all to the club. We have been on a break for the last couple of months, but now we are back. We have a very exciting session coming up today. We have two star speakers. I think Rangarajan sir moved back to the audience. So, sir, I've sent you an invite. Please come up to the stage back again. Thank you. Uh, so, yeah, so before we start, like I'll do a quick recap of what we do here at the Indology Club on Clubhouse. We started this club in March. We are just like three amateur history hobbyists. It was Mani, Arvind, and myself. We started this just to share knowledge about the culture, heritage, and history of India from newer perspectives than what is usually taught in our textbooks. So we were very privileged to get so much love from everyone and have all of you be a part of the journey. Today, unfortunately, due to some constraints, my regular co-hosts Mani and Arvind couldn't be present today. So we have Nivedita and Pranav who have agreed to help with the moderation. Thanks a lot for the support. So our regular sessions are usually in a series format. We like each series is like 8 to 10 episodes each. We have done three series so far. First, we started with Dakshin history, which was history of India from the point of view of the South. And then we moved on to the second series, which is the Bharat Darshan series through temples.
Mhm.
And the third series was Embodiment of Shakti, the glorious female leaders of India. So we spoke about a lot of female leaders like Rani Mangamal, Kilari Channamma, like all the leaders and queens of India back in the day. So it was a very, very exciting session for us to do. Soon we will be starting a new series, which is called the Lesser Known Temples of Vijayanagara. So usually most of the temples that we know about Vijayanagara are either in Hampi or like the Tirupati and Sri Salem temples, but there are quite a few temples of Vijayanagara era which are in South India, so we will be speaking about those. So when we were doing the Bharat Darshan series, we had a thought of doing a special session about the current state of temples and the legal, cultural, social, and various other aspects of temples. So we approached Sri Rangarajan sir, and things have now taken their own shape, and here we are. If you're joining us for the first time, we'd like to welcome you to the Indology Club and request you to please follow the club by clicking on the green heart at the top. You can also please follow the Insta handle and Substack. The details are in the bio. Please share it with your friends, communities, on all other platforms, and please spread the word. So thank you, Setlin. While we have, I think even Mr. Sai Deepak ji also should be joining in a minute or two. So yeah, Rangarajan ji, welcome. So I think this is the first time you are in a clubhouse room and a conversation. So
Yeah,
uh,
yes. Are you able to hear me, all of you?
yes, sir, absolutely. Yeah, loud and
Yes.
clear.
Um, See, this is the divine blessing of Chilkur Balaji that I have been able to participate in the first clubhouse chat of mine. And I would like to thank Samir, who came 2 months back to Chilkur and requested me to be one of the speakers during the clubhouse. Actually, I'm very much new to Clubhouse. You people are aware that I do a lot of tweeting, and I am assuming the amount of social media presence of mine, but I am still not very familiar with this Clubhouse uh, platform. And maybe this is where my Balaji wants me to go further and bring all of you people who are actively into protecting our Sanatana Dharma, culture, traditions, and all from all over the world, and make us a part of this big movement which is being initiated from Chilkur Balaji Temple. It is called Temples Protection Movement. And as you are aware that we are making it a deity-centric approach. A temple is the way the temple has been as an institution is always been a deity centric institution. But of late, people, because of the endowment regulations, the government interference, and all of this stuff. It has been broken down into Archaka issues, land issues, jewelry issues, issues related to security of valuables of the temple. But what happened in this process is the deity has taken a back seat. This is where we are now focusing to bring the deity back to the center stage and make the devotee understand that is the only objective of coming to a temple is to surrender before the deity. That is what our Sanatana Dharma has been, to remind the devotee every day that he is a part of a huge connection with the divine, and he has fallen onto the earth, the bhumi, prakriti sambandham, and he has to go back to the divine cosmos from which he has fallen down. So that is possible only through surrender and sadhana, which is the carrier, and the vehicle for that surrender is the temple system, in which you can find the all the alvars, the acharyas have all praised how the temple used to be. The deity makes the devotee understand the nectar of devotion, taste it, and then crave for the surrender to the Almighty. Today, unfortunately, all these things are lacking in every temple which we are worshipping in. So we have to correct all of that to bring the present generation back to the olden times where we used to enjoy culture, dances, music, and the great rituals which are happening in the temple. So this is where Sai Deepak's book has, if you say, is done kind of an open heart surgery. Open heart surgery, what you do is you do try first to correct the mm, beating heart, which is not properly functioning. So Sai has done both the diagnostic approach and also try to tell us how to correct it. So he is telling one word called decolonialization. This decolonization is a great word which has been coined by Sai Deepak, and is wanting all of us to work towards going back to that connect which was there 200 years back before these Britishers came in, and prior to that the Muslim invasion which was there in the 11th and 12th century. We overcome those kind of waves of Islamic invasion by through devotional movement. This is Bhakti movement which was there in the 13th century, 14th century through great people like Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and all these people brought back the kind of a devotional spirit among us. But we lacked all of that after these 200 years of colonial British East India colonization, where
Sir,
they,
yeah, please.
yes, yes, there we have to target, we have to find out where we are lost our ground and come back to the mainstream. That's what Samir is a gist of what we are doing.
Definitely, sir. Thank you so much for the introduction to what we wanted to hold the session about. I'd also like to welcome Sai Deepak ji, who has just joined us. So I would like to pass the mic on to Nivedita ji to introduce the speakers, and then we can have the opening. Sorry about the background noise.
Thank you, Samir. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank you. Clubhouse, Indology is one of my favorite clubs. So I'm really glad to be here today. So as Sam has already mentioned, we are joined by two extremely special people who are doing phenomenal work in bringing the issues around temples to light. First, we have Sri Rangarajan Ayagaru, who is the chief priest at the Chilukuru Balaji Temple, popularly known as the Visa Balaji Temple in Hyderabad. And anyone who has ever visited the temple could not have missed his presence, his jovial nature, and his witty commentary. So he's a priest who could easily have been a rock star with a microphone, but then, who said that one cannot be both? So I would guess that this is one of the temples in India which is which is visited more by the youth than the elders. And
My personal favorite line of Rangarajan Garu is actually when he says, "Kotiwara nuvu kobbarka tindaniki raa vachi seva cheyi," which means you're not a monkey. Come volunteer here. That's my personal.
yeah, so coming back, yeah, that sort of explains the person that he is. So we need more such people who can blend tradition with the contemporary and make it cool and exciting for the youngsters while preserving, as he earlier said, the essence of our Sanatan Dharma. Rangarajan sir, welcome to Clubhouse and the Indology Club. It's a blessing to have you here. Next, we have Sri J. Sai Deepak ji. I think most of us know him, but still I'll make a formal introduction. He's making all the waves with his latest book, India That Is Bharat, Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution. He's a Supreme Court lawyer who caught the nation's attention during the Sabrimala and Sri Padmanabhaswamy temple cases. He's a lawyer extraordinaire, an exquisite mind, and an eloquent orator. Sai Deepak ji, welcome to Clubhouse and the Indology Club, and congratulations on your new book. Our deities could not have asked for a better person to represent them. And having followed both Rangarajan sir and you on different social media platforms, the magnitude of work that you have done for the temple movement is both humbling and inspiring. So thank you so much for joining us today. Sam, over to you.
Yeah, welcome, Sai Deepak ji.
Namaste.
Uh,
Thank you.
Cool. So let me start with a question for your opening remarks. As Nivedita said, you've been in the spotlight during the Sabarimala case and the Sri Padmanabha Swami case, and about the title of this room, deity-centric temples. So you were the first person to argue on behalf of our deity in the Sabarimala case in 2018. Until then, nobody had argued that our deities have fundamental rights. So where does this argument go from here? Like, how does a deity-centric temple help the society?
Allow me to make a few disclaimers or riders which I think are warranted and in order.
Please.
One, I think what you said was right, that I happen to be in the spotlight, but unfortunately it takes away the attention from a lot of people who have been doing a lot of work. I'm extremely conscious of not using Sabarimala and Padmanabha Swami as my calling cards for two reasons. Only because, one, I don't think it does justice to all the silent people who have been working for several decades now. Two, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. It just so happened that I happened to be prepared for it. Beyond that, frankly speaking, I was and I continue to ride on the coattails of the hard work of a lot of people and the knowledge of a lot of people. And given that I have a social media positional advantage and the fact that I can, even if I say so myself, I think I articulate fairly decently, that gives me the advantage of ventilating and articulating certain issues. So beyond that, I'm at this point merely a glorified messenger and perhaps an overrated messenger at this stage, because frankly, I'm surrounded by people in whose company I typically prefer to keep silent so that I can listen and understand. This is extremely important. I don't have a single humble bone in my body. So therefore, this is not false modesty at play. This is a statement of fact. This is important for most people to know. And I've been kind enough to receive the blessings and the prayers and the, let's say, the support of so many people. And the fact that I have taken a serious interest as far as this particular cause, not as an activist, but merely as an active Hindu and as a lawyer, is the reason that I'm able to articulate some of these issues with a fair degree of, let's say, objectivity, not taking away from the emotional content of my association or attachment to the cause. I hope I'm being clear about this, because every time when somebody introduces me as someone who's argued for Sabarimala and Padmanabha Swami, there is a bit of a squirming that goes on in my entire being, because it seems as if I'm taking credit for everybody else's work and as if I was the only person to argue. It just so happened that perhaps because of my age or because of the position that I took and the fact that people did not expect this particular argument to receive the kind of coverage, this particular submission ended up getting much more spotlight and coverage than the submissions of others. So let me clarify a few things, because I think it's extremely important to clarify this. The council for the Tantri of the Sabarimala temple, Sri V. Giri, also made a few submissions with respect to protection of the deity's sanctity, as well as the temple's, let's say, sanctity, so to speak. However, I can decently say that prior to me making that argument, nobody had specifically pushed to the very specific argument of the deity being a juristic person within the meaning of Article 25 and Article 26 for the purposes of enjoyment of fundamental constitutional freedoms. So that is where my limited contribution comes from. Second, I don't think I'm the first person to actually make this argument in history, because the deity's juristic character has been established since the Privy Council period, when British courts were more than happy to recognize the living personality of the deity for the purposes of religious endowments. It just so happened that I was extrapolating it under the Constitution with respect to the religious practice itself, because my point was, if you're willing to recognize the deity's juristic character for the purposes of ownership of property, for the purposes of taxation, for the purposes of litigation or property litigation in the name of the deity, surely you can't deny the deity a representation. So therefore, I basically said the Boston Tea Party principle says there can't be any representation without, there can't be any taxation without representation. So if the deity can be taxed and the deity can be sued and the deity can sue, then you proceed under the assumption that the deity happens to be a person for the purposes of enjoyment of fundamental freedoms. Plus, I also made the argument that since companies are treated as persons for the purposes of enjoyment of fundamental rights, certain specific fundamental rights, how can that legal fiction be, how can the deity be deprived of the particular legal fiction? This is the sum and substance of the position. There was at least a 5-member team working with me on this particular subject. In fact, this particular idea came from a non-legal member of the team who happened to work as part of the extended team. His surname was Daga. I forget his first name because I haven't interacted with him in a long time now. This particular person raised the argument saying, sir, is it possible to make this argument? Then I rolled it into a constitutional argument and I pulled out judgments to effectively make that case. So it's very, very important to give credit to people who have actually contributed to this. Coming back to the question, Ms. Nivedita wants to make a point. Should I wait for her to make a point before I proceed?
That's acknowledgement. That's applause on Clubhouse side.
Oh, I see. I'm so
I think
sorry.
he's flashing your mics. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So now coming to the question of deity-centric temple movement, trust me when I say this, when the first judgment of Sabarimala, the 28th September 2018 judgment of the 5-judge bench with one dissenting judgment in our favor was delivered, the evening before, I was unsure of how I would react to the judgment if it were to be an adverse verdict. I don't know what the reason was. Maybe my subconscious being was reacting to the moment, but I ended up having a wide smile across my face when the judgment was being pronounced. Because I said, now you have given us an opportunity to exactly dilate upon this particular issue and to explain the nature of the creature that we are dealing with. Because you see, it's easier to explain a certain situation to people when there is a certain degree of interest. I think there is a greater degree of interest in the entire institution as such and not that particular temple itself, precisely because of an adverse verdict. Okay. Otherwise, this particular issue, the larger issue surrounding the treatment of temple, the character of the temple, the control of the particular institution by the state would have been completely gone under the radar. And the temple freedom movement wouldn't have received the fillip that it has after the judgment. Okay. Because according to me, Swami Ayyappa has opened the doors for the temple freedom movement. And according to me, this particular deity who's treated as the son, or let's say as the what we call the Kuttipayan in every temple in Kerala, which is to say, even if there is a Mula Devata of any other temple in Kerala, you'll always find a smaller Sannidhi for Swami Ayyappa. He's seen as the child of that particular state, of every deity. So this particular child is opening, this divine child is opening the doors for temple freedom movement. So I'm very, very happy that an adverse verdict, which they thought would dampen the spirits of the Indic community, the Dharmic community, and the Hindu community, has actually reawakened this particular civilization to the state of affairs of their civilizational nerve centers. Now, I'm so happy that this churn is going on social media and other places, because even when people make stupid statements, like I've seen a couple of gentlemen over the last few days on Twitter saying, comparing nude beaches to the dress code to be observed in nude beaches to even the dress code to be observed in temples. Although I don't disagree, I completely disagree with that particular statement. I'm happy this churn is going on so that we actually know how deracinated, how far away from our culture and our roots we have all moved. Okay, every such statement is proof of the fact that the so-called ideological divide that we observe on Twitter or wherever it is practically useless, because when it comes to some of these central issues, across the aisle, across the spectrum, all of us suffer from this disease called colonial consciousness, which is it's starkly displayed, and it is put on display when it comes to the temple issue, because that's where our misconceptions, that's where our misunderstanding, that's where our distortions with respect to caste relations, societal structures, the role of the Brahmin, the role of the priest, the nature of the temple, the nature of the deity, the ownership of the assets of the temple, who is supposed to control it, what was the relationship of the pre-colonial Raja and the temple. All these issues are being addressed. So it has been my position, I've consistently maintained this position, that along with the temple freedom issue, that particular debate, the caste debate will also be significantly addressed, because this very issue is going to be presented, it has been consistently presented as the bogey to reversion of the community's control over this particular institution. So you will have to address this issue even if you don't want to. This is an elephant in the room that you can't ignore any longer. So I'm very, very happy about this. Notwithstanding the sometimes disappointing statements that come from certain people, I'm saying good. Now the floodgates have been opened. Let's have an open discussion on everything without beating around the bush. Let's talk about who has done what, who is supposed to be doing what is the nature of this particular institution, what is the future of this particular institution. I'm very, very happy this is happening. But the reason why this deity centrism is extremely important is because I've heard this nonsense being spouted and spewed over and over again. All places of worship have the same character. Everything is the same. God is one. अरे भाई, philosophy के तौर पे जब आप बात करते हैं, then the position is very different. But when you speak of an institution, when you speak of a sampradaya, when you speak of a ritual, then the character is different. Then the ontology is different. That means the metaphysics behind that particular thought is different. The epistemology is different. That means the knowledge that goes into the ritual is different. The theology is different. That means the religion that is practiced by the lay person who doesn't understand the metaphysics is different. All of these things are different. So kindly, let's get out of this nonsense that we constantly spew and spout that everything is the same. No, they are not the same. At least metaphysically, they're not equal. Ontologically, they're not equal. Epistemologically, they're not equal. Theologically, they're not equal. They are merely equal before the eyes of the law for the purposes of equal treatment before the law. That doesn't mean that everybody believes in the same thing. So the legal fiction is being now substituted with religious fiction. That stupidity, I think this particular deity-centric movement will effectively unravel, unpack, and tell people, this is what you think you know about your religion. Please unlearn everything and go back to the basics. And please surrender at the feet of your traditional gurus who know what they're talking about, because they practice dharma on a daily basis as a consequence of their anushtanas. Stop consuming stuff from YouTube. Please consume it from the, let's say, sitting at the feet of your gurus. That's what this entire movement is going to push people towards. Gradually telling them, please do not spit on your roots so much. Go back to them. There is still a lot of value attached to it. The Westerner is teaching you the value of your roots. That's the unfortunate reality. Please don't come to a point where your religion is repackaged and sold back to you the way basmati is sold, the way neem is sold, the way charcoal based paste is sold, and all of this happens because your religion is going to be repackaged and sold to you. That, and it can't get worse than that, especially after decolonization. So therefore, this deity centrism is important. No place of worship is public property. Sorry, you do not have an open right of access unless and until you're willing to actually abide by the rules of the particular institution. There is a very specific entity for whom that particular place has been consecrated. If you cannot respect the deity's will, whether it's a her or a him with the H being in super capital, you do not have the right to enter that place. From dress code to eating habits to whatnot, you shall and you must observe everything. If not, please vacate the place. You go and practice whatever you want at your home. In a place where everybody's astha is actually dependent and the sanctity of the place is kept up and kept alive by everybody else's astha, you do not have the right to impose your individual whim and fancy and ideology at that particular place. That position needs to come out in a crystal clear fashion. That's what Sabarimala is about, and that's what the Temple Freedom Movement is about. And I'm very happy that let's say people like Sri Rangarajan Garu have given me the opportunity to learn from them, that I have their constant ear, and hopefully they have my constant ear. So we are able to exchange a lot of ideas. So I'm learning a lot on a daily basis. My position, for instance, if someone were to pick up my tweets of 2015, 2014, or 15 to 16, was more or less this so-called position, which is like, caste is bad, destroy caste, caste is the reason for lack of unity, this and that. I was spouting the same nonsense. There is no distinction between me and some of the people on the non-left today. This is exactly what I said in 2015 to 16. Please trawl and pick out my old tweets, and I'm happy to be embarrassed. I'd say I'm sorry, I've learned better. I have no problems. I will not delete a single tweet on these lines because I'm merely showcasing my own evolution, because Sabarimala effectively opened the door to my evolution, where I said, you knew nothing, you were a cipher, you had no idea what you were talking about. Now you know better, but you still have a lot to know. That's my evolution. So I myself have learned a lot, and there is still a long way to go. So that's the sum and substance of my position.
Thank you so much, Sai Deepak ji, for elaborating it so eloquently. So, Pranav, would you like to ask a question? And at the same time, I would like to also ask the audience if they have any questions. We have, unfortunately, very short time with Sai Deepak ji. So, anybody has a question, to please back channel me so we can take at least one or two questions. Pranav, would you want to go ahead with the question?
I'm here until 9:15, so take your time. I can
Great.
even push it till 9:20, no problem.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Deepak ji. My first question is, what is the difference between deity and God? And in conjunction, what is the position of deity in the current league?
See, I'm not in a position to explain the philosophical position on the difference between deity and God. That is for Rangarajan Garu to explain. The limited understanding that I have is that uh, deity is the consecration of a specific form of energy. And to quote Mata Amritanandabai, who's actually given a fantastic example, it is the difference between a fish which survives in the ocean and the fish that you actually rear in your aquarium, in your homes. So when you take care of it, you have to feed it on a regular basis. You have to take care of it on a regular basis like you would of any other pet. But if it happens to be something that's growing in the wild, like a stray dog, or if it's in the let's say if it's in the pond or the ocean, there's nothing that you need to do. It takes care of itself. So when you speak of a deity, you're actually speaking of a specific form of consciousness, divine consciousness, which has its own attendant rites. From the Prana Pratisthana, or including, let's say, should you choose to desecrate in your own way, which is to say, sometimes what they do is the Shivalinga is actually submerged in the water if you choose to close the temple for whatever reason. There could be any number of reasons for it. So, when you say deity, there are rituals, there are specific sampradayas, there is specific liturgy, there is a specific, let's say, form of worship, and therefore there are specific communities which are divinely ordained to take care of it. Now, I know for a fact that this is going to ruffle a lot of feathers when they say, do you mean the Brahmin community? No. Temple to temple, the sampradaya varies. It could be sometimes Brahminical communities, it could be non-Brahminical communities. That depends entirely on the Shastra or the Sthala Purana or the specific, let's say, lore or let's say Itihasa or Purana that applies to that particular temple. So, for instance, uh, there is a very specific Purana for the Sabarimala temple. Similarly, when you go to the Tirchendur Subramanya Swami temple, which is on the coast of Tamil Nadu, then there is a different Purana altogether. And there the belief is that this particular tradition, this is the first guru of this particular tradition. Typically, it's the deity. That particular deity has given specific instructions as to who shall take care of it. What are the communities that shall take care of it? What are the rules that they're supposed to follow? How are they supposed to lead their lives? So when you speak of a deity, you're looking at an energy specific ecosystem which also creates its own communities. That is the nature of this particular creature. Therefore, it is impossible to actually dissociate this particular argument from the so-called caste debate that's going on today. Because when you say, let's actually have a blanket approach to all these temples, what is your position going to be with respect to the millennia of received wisdom and the specific communities and the specific divine instructions that you're supposed to follow? I am being told that this grand unity project, which all of us constantly keep talking about when it comes to the Hindu community, is the altar at which divine instructions with respect to each of these places of worship must be sacrificed. I cannot buy that. I am not in a position to buy that. And the more I read it, I am not going to ever agree to this. So I will always look for different forms of creating stakeholdership so that everybody feels associated with that particular institution. But that cannot come at the core expense of the central practice of that particular institution, because that is divinely ordained. So when someone says Hindu Dharma is all about seeking, not believing, are ye kya bakwas hai? At the end of the day, you both seek and you believe. That's why I keep giving this specific example that I've told you everything about the Sabarimala tradition. Let me see if your knowledge gives you the courage to stand in front of the temple to protect it from the lathi charge of the policeman, or is it conviction that gives you the confidence to wear the blows, to wither the blows? That's the question that you have to ask yourself. Never underestimate the value of conviction. So when you say that Hindu Dharma is only about knowledge and not conviction, sorry, it is an inextricable enmeshing of both knowledge and belief that constitutes Hindu Dharma. It's impossible for you to separate the two. You need to understand, yes, but you also need to believe. Both work hand in hand. It's like the double helix of the DNA. It's impossible for you to separate it. So therefore, when you speak of the deity's rights, this is the core philosophy that you're supposed to, let's say, think about or follow. Now, when you transpose the legal machinery or the legal framework on this, what are you looking at? Okay, if the deity is the central object of consecration, worship, and protection, what does it translate to? It translates to two things. The land and that Garbhagriha belong to the deity. He is the owner or she is the owner, whatever the case may be. Second, the assets which are endowed to that particular institution are effectively registered in the name of the deity. So what happens to the human agents? The human agents are merely seen as let's say implementers or interceders of the deity's will. So just as the company is a fiction of let's say the mind's creation, and the directors and its employees and stakeholders are seen as human agents who are working at the company's behest and to enact its own will, which is captured in its articles of association or its memorandum of association, AOA, MOA, and all of that. That is exactly how the temple also functions. I'm giving a very crude comparison here. So therefore, the law over the years, at least British Hindu law, which is to say Hindu law as understood by British men and British courts, has recognized that the deity happens to be the pious purpose around which this entire universe or this ecosystem revolves, the Hindu ecosystem revolves. So they have recognized that to protect, if the deity happens to be the object of the belief, and that is sacred belief, then you need to put in place those mechanisms that preserves the integrity of the endowment, that preserves the integrity of the money that is actually given to that particular deity, whatever it may be. So the entire object of this legal system is to protect the pious purpose for which this money has been endowed or the property has been endowed, and the pious purpose happens to be the deity. Okay, that's the nature of the legal system. Now you see, when the British judgments were actually delivered, you did not have the Constitution of 1950. So therefore, once the Constitution of 1950 comes about, there have been many instances and several judgments where courts were then forced to ask, what is the nature of this endowment under the Constitution now, because this is the supreme law of the land. So you will find several judgments where British judgments and the principles culled out by them have been adopted by post-independence Indian courts, because frankly speaking, there is not too much of inconsistency between the British man's understanding and the subsequent understanding of the Supreme Court under the Constitution, precisely because there is room available under the Constitution to accord the deity a legal character as a person. Because any lawyer worth his salt will tell you that person under the law means both a natural person, that's a human being, as well as a juristic person, which is to say a person who is recognized as a person under the law through a fiction created by the law, like a company. So let's take it to the next level. Tomorrow, there is a chance that the definition of a person may be extended to a robot as well, or something that is the creation of artificial intelligence, should it have a certain degree of sentience, so that it has its own ability to think. If it has the element of free will, it becomes a person for the purposes of the law. So this is how the law has treated it. So the reason I'm making this entire argument is Hindu ontology, epistemology, and theology is capable of and has been accommodated under the British legal system significantly. And the reason for this is every time a colonizer sets up a legal system in different jurisdictions, they try and morph their legal system to tailor it to local practices. So that if you have, let's say, a law with respect to religious institutions which applies to churches, then they try and somehow craft it and tailor make it to suit the needs of the local community. That's what they tried and did as far as our institutions are concerned. But the worst part is the British man was much clearer and much better at recrafting his principles to accommodate our beliefs, and Indian courts post independence have been terrible at it. At least in the 50s and 60s were still better. But post 70s, especially after the introduction of the word secular, for some reason the wiring of the legal system has changed, where now the approach to Indian theology, specifically Indic theology and Indic institutions, is very, very different. It's a case of the convert being much more zealous about the converted religion than the original believer himself. So that is where we are today. So the position of the deity is crystal clear under the constitution. I'm not making an overzealous argument. I am not making an argument that is not founded or rooted in the language of the law or by judgments. Several judgments exist to this particular effect. And those who want to read more about this, please visit the website of People for Dharma, where you will find all my written submissions. And you will see the elaboration for each of these points. It may be slightly loaded with legalese, but you will find support for it in judgments. We have called out the principles in bullet points also. So please read them. You'll understand the position even better.
Uh, can I just add
Yes, sir.
myself here?
Yes, sir. Please, yeah.
First of all, we all have to be thankful to Sai Deepak for the Bharat trilogy, which is the first volume which has come in India, that is Bharat. This whole clubhouse, for which it is first time for myself and also the first time for Sai Deepak. We are doing a debut together, and the you can see the amount of time he spends on temple related cases is just 10%, less than 10% of his entire legal uh, time allotted for cases which are more of professional activity. This one, he says, we have interacted a lot of time during the briefings and all that. Says this is a service to my dharma, my commitment towards dharma. More than the arguments which he does inside the court, which are not reproduced verbatim unless somebody has got a patient time to read the written arguments which he said is available. The book which is brought out today, my elder brother had gone to Chinnajiyar Swami, our Chinnajiyar Ramanuja Chinnajiyar Swami, and he had submitted at his lotus feet the book for consumption of our Chinnajiyar Swami. He was full of happiness when he saw that book, because whatever small little bit of uh, you know affection which everybody is expressing towards Sai Deepak is because of bringing all the agony which we used to have because of so many words. See, like just you ask the difference between deity and God. See, unfortunately, I am not in a position to explain in a language which cannot explain the deity. The deity is a word which is an English word. ఇప్పుడు నేను స్వామి అఖిలాండ కోటి బ్రహ్మాండ నాయకుడు పరవ్యూహ విభవ అంతర్యామి ఇవన్నీ నేను ఎట్లా చెప్తాను? హౌ కెన్ ఐ టెల్ ఇన్ ఇంగ్లీష్? ఇంపాసిబుల్ ఫర్ మీ టు టెల్. సో ది ప్రాబ్లం lies there, and the court is unfortunately looking at all these aspects from a small concise small hole, trying to imagine trying to put an elephant in a small scent bottle. You cannot put it. And the most important question is, uh, how stupid have we been the last 70 years to denigrate every custom and every usage which has stood its time for thousands of years? I'm not talking about sati, I'm not talking about widow remarriage, I'm not talking about all of that. Those things have been through a legislation in the parliament or something like that. But here, the court is being used by some public interest litigators to attack a custom, a usage, a tradition, a belief. So even bursting crackers, even our Ganesh idols, the Rath Yatra of Puri Jagannath during the last year, and all these places, the affected party is the deity. The deity, when we start our ritual every day morning, you know what we say? Sri Bhagavad Agneya Sriman Narayana Prityartham. So I am doing every activity in the temple not to please the devotees, not to please the state, not to please the court, not to please the entire world. I am doing my every ritual in the temple to please my Lord, who is the Narayana, who is the deity of the temple, that institution. If you go to the Shaiva temple, they will say Parameshwara Prityartham. So they also are performing every ritual to please the deity who has been incarnated or invoked inside the in the temple, and comes the kind of idol worship. Now, if you say the idolaters are sinners, as far as the colonialists have been telling, you know, they are false gods, the stones, the metal, and all these things, they just tell all sorts of nonsense. But if you take a deity, in the Garbhagriha, and you add all the aura which is there during the ritual, which is there, the ringing of the bell, the chanting of the Vedas, the the uh, singing of the Sankirtanas, it is all going to add a kind of a devotional atmosphere. If these things are removed, it's just an idol. So that is what they have done. They have attacked the basic head of the system. If the head of the system is what they, as far as they are concerned, is a Brahmin. That's what they said. The Brahmin is not the head of the system. Bhagavan, in the incarnation, he says Purusha Sukta. That is what they target. All these people, the so-called Ambedkarites, even Ambedkar did not tell that. The so-called these people who, which just now Sai has said, we are waiting for the second part of his Bharat trilogy, which is going to, start talking about the Periarism. When Periyar started this Justice Party in 1920 to 1935, 1940, the language he spoke was only to attack the Brahmins. After independence, it converted into breaking the Ganesh idol and putting slipper garlands on Rama, doing Ravana Leela. You know, we do Rama Leela on Vijayadashmi day. He changed it into Ravana Leela. He wrote on his this thing. So how they have converted the entire movement anti-Brahminism into anti uh, deity movement. So that is what he mentioned already in his book, the India, that is Bharat. In one single paragraph he has said how it has been slowly changed from anti-Brahminism towards anti-deity, anti-Rama, anti-Krishna. So this is where we have fallen a prey to the kind of uh, the scheming which the colonials, the evangelists did, and they totally converted our way of thinking also. Today, somebody, if you ask the present generation child, they go to the school, they have a comparison between the um, uh, people who worship each and every deity. Suppose somebody says Jesus or a Muslim says Allah, they have the kind of knowledge about their system. Our people, they do not have that much amount of knowledge. If I ask, in Chilkur, we daily I have, because it's COVID time, I am not able to interact. I suddenly, when during the pradakshina, I asked one child, seventh class child, I call him. I ask him, what is the mother's name of Lakshmana? And one child suddenly said Anushka. So that is the type of knowledge which our child is getting today at the home. So we have to bring back our, every aspect of our culture, our tradition, and even leave alone the temple system. Temple system, we are struggling to bring back the kind of devotional atmosphere among the people who run the temples, the trustees, the archakas. The present situation is the executive officers were more secular in nature. In fact, they think, like, why people in Tamil Nadu are fighting for opening the temples on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, whereas the all other religious institutions are having their own way of having a mass and worship and all that. So this is where I would like to, on behalf of all of you, thank Sai, and he's a Kuti Payan. He told about Ayyappa. For all of us, Kuti Paya is Sai Deepak, who has brought the kind of discussion in the center stage where we all had a hushed tones of discussion. We were having in the drawing rooms. We were not coming out in the open and discussion. The last 1.5 months has been enjoyable for me. every time he goes and interacts with a new audience, and that is there in the YouTube. In this is a kind of among the youth, I have seen so many people who have told me that we have read the book, we have seen what type of research he has done. He has not done. Sai has not put his words there. He has just extracted the parliament discussions in the British Parliament and brought it into his book. And through you, I would like to request all these Indology Club people to get to read that book and see how we have been fooled into, walked into the trap of these evangelists. That's what is my humble submission.
Thank you, Rangarajanji and Saiji, for giving the philosophical and the legal perspective on that question, and for giving us pertinent thoughts to ponder. We have a question from the audience. This is from Vidya. She asks us that if there is a scenario where all the temples are back in the Hindu fold, what is the way forward for Hindus with respect to the management of temples? Should there be courses on temple management, or should the business sector pitch in? So, what are your thoughts on this? Both of you can answer this. Take the.
Can I proceed to
Yes.
answer this, Rangarajan Garu?
Yeah, you should.
Okay. So, see, when people ask me this question, I try to tell them as calmly as possible that first ask yourself, who did they take the temple from? So, when a temple is taken over by the state, surely the state knows who is it supposed to give it back, because they are the primary owners. Now, the surprising part is whenever this discussion starts, we are being told entity A or community A happens to be the community from whom this particular institution has been taken over by the state. But now we don't know who to give it back to. Okay, and who will run it? The point is, if you take a look at any of the HRC legislations, which is the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowment legislations, you please take a look at it. You have the composition of a trust specified in the legislation itself, which speaks of who is supposed to occupy that particular position, how are they supposed to be elected. These are prescriptions and procedures which are captured in crystal clear detail in some of those legislations. In fact, in most of those legislations. So when people think that we have challenged the entire legislation, no. We have only challenged those aspects of the legislation which give the state uncontrolled, unbridled, untrammeled powers over of the temple's both religious activities as well as secular activities. So those portions of the legislation which prescribe who must govern the temple and how the temple must be governed, we are more than happy to actually keep those provisions as is, whereas because these legislations are crystal clear that the trustees will have to be practicing Hindus who believe in the sampradaya of that particular temple, and the temple must be run in accordance with the practices of that particular temple, whatever the denomination it be, whatever its agam shastras may be, or even non-agamic principles. That is exactly what is there. So therefore, assume for a moment that you have taken it over from a certain community, give it back to that particular community, and you already have rules prescribed for audit mechanisms and whatnot. Continue with that. So it's not as if this is going to be returned to some amorphous, vague, indeterminate mass of people. There are people who continue to exist from that particular community who are waiting for the temples to be given back to them. That's one. Second, assume for a moment that no person of a particular community is coming forward or saying that I want to take this back for so and so reasons because I am the descendant of this particular tradition. In such an instance, the government has the power and the duty to conduct an election within that particular community for the purposes of appointment of trustees. That's how it typically works. Just as you have elected members who run the Shiromani Gurudwara Prabandhak Committee, which runs the Golden Temple, and that is the structure that applies for the Gurudwaras across the country under a very specific legislation of 1920, just as you have elected members who occupy positions with respect to the various waqfs across the country with respect to Muslim institutions, that is the same mechanism that already exists significantly in most of these legislations. The problem is that despite the presence of these mechanisms in the legislation, you don't need a separate mechanism. What the state does is that it circumvents the entire procedure of community involvement and simply proceeds to appoint an executive officer. That's what we have a primary problem with, saying when you don't have an order which says this is the corruption that has taken place in this particular institution, what on earth is your business to step into this particular institution when it is supposed to be run by the trustees who are elected under the mechanisms provided by the Act itself. That's exactly what most people are missing. Let me therefore highlight something very, very important. The very
Okay, I think there's okay. There is. Sorry, Sai. I think there was a little
yeah,
glitch.
sorry. So when someone asks this very question, who will it go back to? That itself, and this is not a personal comment, I typically don't make personal comment, I am saying the community is displaying its own ignorance of how its institutions have been run prior to the takeover by the government. That is exactly where the problem is. You don't even know how it was run, you don't even know who was running it, and how the affairs of that institution were managed. Therefore, as part of my own initiative, just to actually address this, I will be, of course, I have to start working on the second book. And the second book, I will not be able to touch on this particular issue in detail, but I will be starting a separate column altogether where I'm going to describe in detail both the practice as it existed before the takeover by the state and the current mechanism under the legislation itself, which still permits and envisages, let's say, community participation, and how will the process of reversion actually take place. These are aspects that I hope to discuss in crystal clear detail so that we're able to address this. I'll give you a very clear example. Uh, Out of, let's say, lakhs of temples, you're actually looking at a few hundred temples which are really major institutions from the standpoint of, let's say, attraction of a lot of people, management of security, crowd management, and all of that. Or let's say, even for that matter, the Tirupati or Jagannath Puri temple and all these temples. In those institutions, the state still does not elect, it directly proceeds to appoint. And yesterday I was having a discussion with a genius from the left who was telling me that even when the state appoints its own members to a trust, it is not controlling the institution. Apparently, it is merely managing the institution. I said, you blur the lines between management and control when community has no say and the people who are sitting on this particular institution's board are all your appointees. So therefore, we are saying, give the community a chance. Then the question will be, who will appoint, who will elect, and how will this election be held? Well, for every temple, you are looking at stakeholders who are associated with the particular denomination. So there is a procedure under the Act, under the TNS HRC Act, as to who are the people who are entitled to stand for that particular office, who are the people who are entitled to participate in the election process as the electorate itself. All of this is laid out. These are aspects which so far people have not discussed in public domain. I hope to bring it out gradually through a set of pieces so that this specific issue is addressed. Because I think all of us have spoken on the problem enough. We have actually diagnosed the problem enough. I will now start presenting a few solutions in discussion with others. So wait for a couple of pieces to address this in a very specific fashion. But let me address the larger question. What is the larger question? The question is, once it goes back to private hands, if private hands effectively misrun that particular institution, what is the remedy or the recourse that the public has? Now, that is precisely why you need to have the HRC department, which steps into the picture to only remedy the situation. That is the limited role that is constitutionally envisaged for them. So when you say it goes back to private hands, it doesn't mean zero accountability and zero answerability. So one, this is the role that the HRC department was originally intended to perform. But the second aspect of the issue that most people don't understand is, assume for a moment that you did not have the HRC legislation at all. That is, you did not have a Hindu specific temple control legislation at all in the first place. What is the mechanism under which these temples function? Under the Trusts Act, because every temple has a trust. Now, when you run a trust, anybody who's run a trust or who's been a part of the trust will tell you that there are audit mechanisms, there are resolutions. You have to follow all of that. So if you're looking at financial accountability, the very fact that the temple happens to be a trust or run under the Trusts Act automatically imposes certain financial obligations. Now, when that happens, the state can certainly say a religious institution which is run in the Trusts Act must be subject to random audit checks by the state government. The moment you say that, you don't need a separate legislation. This is already addressed. So why do you need a super legislation which is Hindu specific over and above the Trusts Act when you already have a legislation that deals with how trusts are supposed to be run? So unfortunately, this discussion is being muddled and it's constantly being mugged up by saying, oh, there will be caste factionalism, oh, there will be this and that. Name one religious institution of which of the community where there is no factionalism. Look at the fight that goes on between the Keralite Christians on a regular basis with respect to the Peravom Church. Look at the kind of factionalism that goes on in the Gurudwaras. Look at the kind of factionalism even with respect to Waqfs. Are you telling me that there are no gang wars that happen on those aspects in those communities? Of course it happens. That's no reason to actually say, I will deprive you of your independence completely. No. In any case, as the state, you can only do what the constitution permits you to. You have no other justification to sit in my institution without giving me constitutional justifications. As on date, what you're doing is fundamentally and blatantly unconstitutional. Therefore, a response needs to come from the state as to how does it justify its position. Until then, I don't need to. Sorry. So if someone tells me that until the solution comes about, I will continue with something that is patently unconstitutional, well, that's not how the law works. You can't say, give me a better solution. Until then, I will continue with this thing which is on the face of it illegal and unconstitutional. That's really not the argument. So the court is, so assume for a moment you're before the court cannot say, give me an alternative mechanism, and until then I will continue I'll allow the state to continue running the affairs of the temple, even though it's unconstitutional. That would be a blatantly unconstitutional argument for the judiciary also to give. You can't say that until a solution is presented, present unconstitutionality must be continued with. That cannot be permitted under any circumstances. So I think we've reached, it's 9:22. I can at best take one more question, and after that, I must take your leave.
Thank you so much for being so gracious.
This question from the audience. Can you differentiate the roles between judiciary and the government in redeeming temples?
Just a second, please. Sorry, my trainer is waiting. Go on. What was your question again, please?
This question is from the audience. Can you distinguish the roles of judiciary and government when redeeming temples back to deity?
So it's like this. Be it the judiciary or the executive, there are red lines in the first place. One, to argue that an elected government can do whatever it wants because it enjoys popular will is not permissible, because even an elected government cannot do anything that alters the fundamental character of an institution. That's the first thing that people need to understand. So merely because the government does it, it doesn't become automatically constitutional. Whatever they do has to fall within the four corners of the constitution. Second, as far as the judiciary is concerned, it needs to test the act of a government on the four corners of the constitution, which is to say, the executive or the legislature happens to be the prime mover of a legislation, which is to say, they are the ones to initiate a certain act. Whether the act is constitutional or not is to be tested by the judiciary. Now, what has happened over the years is that practices of temples, religious practices of temples, are being tested constitutionally by the court. So, for instance, whether it is Sabarimala or any other institution, we have basically asked this question: how does the judiciary have the power under the constitution to pick up a certain practice from a temple and examine it for constitutionality? That is not the judiciary's role under any circumstances, because the judiciary can primarily preside over what? The illegality or the legality of the acts of the state. Temple is not state. Since the temple is not state, how do you exercise your powers under the constitution to examine the validity of the temple's practices? That is one central question that we've asked in Sabarimala Singh. At best, that question can be raised by the legislature or the executive, because these are elected authorities or elected bodies. You're not even elected. The constitution does not even envisage such powers as far as you're concerned. So how do you sit over decisions like dahi handi ka height kitna hona chahiye, Mahabaleshwar mein ya Ujjain Mahakaleshwar mein kitna doodh lagna chahiye, whether women of reproductive age group can enter Sabarimala or not? These are not questions which are within your remit. No judiciary in any advanced jurisdiction, or at least in those jurisdictions that we constantly slavishly import principles from, that is the United States or UK, on both sides of the Atlantic, none of those courts actually cross these boundaries. India happens to be the only country which claims to follow the Commonwealth of, let's say, the common law principles, and continues to flout the line, the clear red line that is to be drawn between the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. And this has just gone on for years and years and years. So two things are central as far as the Sabarimala case is concerned. One is, of course, the treatment of Hindu institutions by the state. But the second is whether the judiciary can cross certain red lines which the constitution has painted for it, which is to say, this is something that falls in the realm of the elected body, because the elected body is assumed to be in touch with the people. Therefore, any decision that it takes is assumed to have the support of the people, which can be challenged in court, of course, but that is the first presumption. You don't even have this power in the first place. You're not an elected body. And no unelected body can sit and say, I will reform the rest of the society. You don't have that power. If this is a democracy which follows a parliamentary and republican form of system, then you, as an unelected body, which has a very limited mandate to look for constitutional compliance, cannot decide on the constitutionality or the illegality of any societal practice in the name of reform. That is only for the legislature and the judicial and the executive to do. Period. So this principle applies equally to the deities issues. You cannot sit in judgment over the practices that are to be observed with respect to the deity. If you look at let's say United States or UK, what they do is that whenever such an issue comes up before the legal institution or the judicial institution, a person who is treated as an authority or an expert with respect to the religious affairs of that particular institution, typically a bishop or someone, is appointed by the court to guide the court and assist the court in understanding the practice. And 9 out of 10 times, I would say even 10 out of 10 times, the court typically defers to that particular opinion, because if you claim to be a secular institution or a secular state, you have no business and you do not have the institutional training to understand the practices of a particular religious place. Therefore, you're expected to defer to the expertise and the opinion and the competence of someone who comes from that particular fraternity, who has the training in that particular subject. That is exactly what you're supposed to be doing in Sabarimala. If the Tantri is basically telling you, this is the nature or the character of this particular deity, where he is an eternal celibate, an Aishthika brahmachari, these are the restrictions that are applicable as a consequence of his Naishthika brahmacharya, and therefore this is the group, a select group of people who are to be kept out of it. There ends the discussion. Beyond that, the judiciary cannot enter into that particular discussion. Whether this is right or wrong, or whether this is something that needs reform, that the state can look at. But even the state cannot change the character of a temple. Now, unfortunately, when I make this statement, people will say, oh, you would have given the same argument with respect to untouchability. Then I have to ask this question. I'm forced to ask this question. Every time I choose to present an argument which is in favor of protection of the religious practices of the temple, why does your mind constantly run to untouchability? Is it your case that Hinduism and Hindu institutions and Hindu practices are only about untouchability? Therefore, there is something fundamentally wrong in your head. You need professional help, where every time we discuss the practices related to the temple, you would say, but no, at one point you decided not to allow certain people inside the temple because of untouchability. Why don't you accept the fact that the society has moved on and it did not require a judicial intervention to do this? And secondly, can't you strike a distinction between untouchability, which was followed, and a certain practice which is meant to preserve the sanctity of that particular temple because it is the repository of a certain energy? That is why I believe, just as Hitler has become the convenient poster boy for certain arguments, saying that this person is like Hitler, that person is like Hitler, similarly, when it comes to Hindu institutions, untouchability and sati have become the bogies to effectively stifle and silence you from making any legitimate argument to preserve tradition. So I think it's time to call out this BS and to say, sorry, if this is not bullshit, I would politely call it bovine feces. You really don't know what you're talking about. And if every time you compare this, you're comparing apples with oranges, there is a serious problem and a serious lack of proportion in this entire discussion. So therefore, when a practice is being discussed, please learn to assess that particular practice on its own merits, instead of constantly using untouchability as the touchstone to see whether this is similar to untouchability. You don't understand the concept, then at least have the humility to say, I don't know. Then learn. Please zip it and learn. That's been my constant exhortation everywhere. Everybody wants to give opinion on everything. Everybody wants to gyan pelify and everything. I'm like, boss, I've had too much of this nonsense, especially on social media. People sitting on social media will decide what a temple is supposed to practice or not, what kind of clothing people are supposed to wear or not. Do you even know what you're talking about? Do you understand the nature of the particular institution? So at this stage, I genuinely believe that if there is a community that needs to understand Hinduism better, it is Hindus themselves. Everybody else understands this better than us. That is the unfortunate reality.
I would like to little bit add to Sai. I think Sai is running out of time to leave. I know. Just 2 minutes, Sai. We'll all close together.
Yes, sir.
One important thing which Sai has brought us to is the 1936 Temple Entry Proclamation, for which we all should be grateful to Sri Ananta Padmanabha Swami. Through his dasas, 1300 and odd temples were open to all the sections of society, not through judicial interference. not through judicial intervention. It was through a proclamation done by Chitra Tirunal Balarama Varma in November 12th, 1936. It's extremely great decision which was taken, which shut the mouth of a lot of colonialists, and that is how our kind of reform happened. And this Tirupan Alvar, which Munivahana Utsavam, which we did 2700 years back, we enacted in 2018, April 16, is another example how our deity asks us to reform ourselves, to be careful when you treat a people, you cannot discriminate, you cannot insult people based on their background, their type of birth, and all that. So, thank you, Sai. And so much time we expected you to be only for half an hour today, but you extended it till 9:30. I think you are running out of time. And Samir, and
Yes, sir.
I think we should all close now. And
Okay.
we had a
We did
wonderful
have a
session.
couple of more questions to you, sir, if you have the time, after we let Sai Deepakji go,
Yeah,
but if it's okay.
I'm available for another 10 more minutes. I think let us
Okay,
allow Sai to
great,
lead.
sir. Yes, sir. So, Sai Deepakji, before you go, I just want to mention a tribute to K. Prasaran Garu. I think it is his 94th birthday today. He's the one who stated about Lord Ayyappa being a Naistika Brahmacharya in Supreme Court. So,
Right, right,
we
right.
wanted to bring that to light. So, thank you so much for your valuable time. It's always fascinating to listen to you. We hope to see more of you on this platform. So, may the deities continue to bless you and all the best for your book tour.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much for
so
joining.
much. Thank you. Namaskaram. Thank you.
Namaskaram, sir. So, yeah, Pranav or Nivedita, so did you have a question to Rangarajanji?
Yes, I have one question. Sir, this is from audience. Sir, we want to start doing puja in Ellora Kailasha temple and convert it into a living temple. Please throw some light on how we can convert a non-living temple like Ellora Caves or Rudra Mahalya in Gujarat temple into a living temple. In conjunction, we have one more question. How do we convert all ancient museums into temples which were ancient? I mean, earlier they were.
Yes. You will be happy to listen to one activity which was already begun. The first thing which is happening in Hampi. If people have gone to Hampi, there is one lot of complexes in temple complexes in Hampi where they trying to revive the rituals in the temple, which the Krishna Devaraya descendants and the few good Samaritans together have joined as a trust, and they are trying to revive the rituals in the temples in Hampi. Similarly, I would like to say that the people around the communities in Ellora, they could put petition to the cultural ministry to ask them to allow them to have rituals in Ellora, because Archaeological Survey of India is just the conservator of the monument. One time it was a flourishing religious institution. Wherever you go, this is a very very large debate, which is happening today. So we are asking, even those deities, the idols which have been returned by the American government. When Modi ji went to US last time and he brought some more than 130, 140 murtis back, they all have to go back to the temples which they belong to. And if you see, if you all of you go to the Google and click on one temple, Kallidai Kurichi. The spelling is Kallidai Kurichi. Kallidai Kurichi. 32 years after the Nataraja idol was stolen from that institution, it was brought back from Australia last year, and the deity was taken in a procession from railway station to the temple. How the entire community celebrated, as if they are bringing back a person who has come back after a long journey outside. So that type of community celebration is required to happen in all these religious institutions, which are now just like museums. They cannot be run like museums. They have to have the rituals why they were constructed at one point of time. Whatever has to be done, I think we have to work for revival of these rituals and pujas in those institutions.
Sir, thank you so much. You mentioned the the family of Krishnadevaraya's who are doing work in Hampi. You'll be happy to know that one of the persons like Tirumala Devaraya, the current heir to the throne, so His Highness, he was really gracious enough to bless us with his presence here in the Ethnology Club when we hosted a room about the Vijayanagara kingdom,
Hmm.
about the Vijayanagara Empire. So he was
Correct.
part of us with the session on in the
Correct.
session. So yes. Pranav, I believe you had one more question from the audience.
Yes, this is. I'm constructing the question into my own words because it's a very long question. But what I understood is Varna or caste system going to be fluid? As in, can a non-Brahmin by birth be a deity's messenger to the contemporary world? I think Rangarajan Garu will be the perfect one to answer this because
See, unfortunately, we all are we are all being brought into this trap of the colonial fellows who always tell things like caste, varna, and try to put us on the defense. Unfortunately, people are forgetting so many saints who have come from different walks of life. If you take the Alvars, among the 12 Alvars, very, very few of them are Brahmins of the 12 Alvars. If you take the Nayanars, 63 Nayanars, there are from different walks of life, different Varnas, you know, and if you take Sant Ravidas, of the 14th and 15th century, he was a cobbler, a chamar, but he had composed so many devotional bhajans and kirtans which are finding the place in Guru Granth Sahib. Sant Ravidas is chamar, is a cobbler, and he used to be worshipped by so many Brahmins used to sit and listen to his discourses on Bhagavad Gita. And he was a descendant of, he was a Shishya of Ramananda Charya, who belonged to this class of Ramananda Sampradaya. So, uh, let us talk about Annamaya. Annamaya brought about the concept of, Brahma Mokate, Para Brahma Mokate. And we had Adivan Shatakopa Yatindra Mahadeshkan 600 years back, who was the preceptor or guru of these Vijayanagara kings. So, yeah, I agree. We have already had these people, but our own history has been uh, rubbed off by these people who have been given the freedom to write our history. Now we have to reclaim even that history through enlightening the whole world about the devotional movements which happened. Kanakadasa, Purandaradasa, and Sant Ravidas. All these people have to be brought back to the limelight by people like us. I think I made myself clear.
Yes, sir. So we have another question from the audience. What is the position of the movement with respect to the Grama Devtas and their worship?
See, the Grama Devatas, they are the Kshetra Palakas. If you take, for example, what is happening, are you aware that the Padmanabhapuram, the deity as Saraswati Ammavaru, is now traveled 100 kilometers and is now in Tiruvananthapuram. The Saraswati Ammavaru is escorted by the Grama Devata of that Padmanabhapuram, Sushindra. And there is also the Skanda. These three deities together go 100 kilometers from on the shoulders of people. They are not going on a truck or a lorry or anything. They are taken 78 kilometers by walk from one temple to another temple. So the it is happening between two states. Tamil Nadu police, they give 21 gun salute when they come out of the temple, and then the Kerala they enter. The escort is provided by the Kerala police for this deity. They camp for the entire Navratri there. So the Grama Devata are part of the entire Hindu religion because they are, if you take for example Mariamma, they are all the deities who have protected the common men from diseases. Even for somebody was telling there is a need for worshipping a deity for preventing the corona to spread again. So that type of deities are, Grama Devata Puja is a part of our system of worship.
Thank you, sir. Pranav, I believe you have a.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, yes. So this is with respect to the Tamil Nadu government usurping 2,000 tons of gold. Now they have missed noting a lot of land of temple. So can we trust the government again in terms of usurping the gold of the temples? And what are the steps that have been taken, and what are the steps that should be taken so that it doesn't happen in future?
No. We cannot trust the government of Tamil Nadu by even 1 gram of gold. No, because just we now talked about Krishna Devaraya. No, Krishna Devaraya has, has gifted one great, amulet to Sri Ranganatha, which is owned by Namperumal. Every time he walks out in a procession during the Utsavam, it contains the entire deity Padmanabha, the Ranganatha Swami, with the divine concerts. It's a beautiful, if you just go and click the Krishna Devara's gift on the, Google, you can see this type of, what do you call, artwork can never be replicated now. And the government of Tamil Nadu has no business to take the gold, melt it, and then put it in bank. And we don't want it also. Who will be who will be accountable for the collection of the gold? Number one, who will be? That is the secondary aspect. It is a deity's ornament is something like deity himself being melted. We cannot allow the ornaments of the deities cannot be melted, and that is not valuable in crores of rupees. It is infinite. The value of that is infinite, which cannot be equated by any valuer of the world. Okay, so we are very clear on that. We cannot trust the government. We don't want allow them to touch the gold of the temples. Sorry. And there is a need for these clubhouse people, whoever is listening to me, to take this message forward and spread it. It should become a movement. There should be not only the cases in the court. I think there is a need for educating every common man on the ground.
Thank you so much, sir. Sam, can we take one more question or?
I think we should close, Sam.
Yes.
Then one last question, I think we'll close.
Okay. Pranav, you have the
Yes,
question.
sir. So I got like 7 or 8 questions. This one, same question. What should we as individuals do? What is your message to individuals for the for deity-centric temple?
I think this is a brilliant point to end on. So what should the people do, sir?
This is what you people have already started doing. This is a need for educating the common man. Every time you people are going to a temple, very limited amount of time you have in your very busy schedules. What type of thinking you, what type of talking you do, what type of activities you do. See, this requires more of physical effort in reviving the kind of a deity centric temple movement. If you look at the number of temples which are there in ruins today, they are in dilapidated conditions today. You all date back to your own village and see what are you connected to a temple which is an ancient temple in your village. What am I supposed to do to this temple? Are there the proper rituals happening in the temple? Is the property safe in the temple? The landed property, what is happening to that? Or the deity, the idols and the murtis which are there, are they protected? These are the questions I think you people as a family should ask yourself. And if hundreds of years back your great grandfathers, the forefathers, have given their life to protect those institutions, we have no business to stay away from them. We have to come back and then say what type of support we need. I don't say that all of us come together and have a platform. Each one of you can, I think, is capable of having his own village temple is a source of getting inspired to protect your institution. It could have individualistic problems. It could have individualistic solutions also. So My request would be you start doing that at the grassroots level. Definitely this movement will pick up. And remember, in 1920, just now Sai was mentioning how the Gurudwaras were, Shiromani Gurudwara Prabandhak Committee Act came in. That is a 15-year-old struggle by all the Gurudwaras in the entire country, where all the Gurudwaras were not in the hands of the Sikhs. They were under the hands of Mahants. Their Mahants were in the hands of Britishers. So they did not allow proper Guru Granth Sahib, recital also. So they reclaimed the entire thing by a movement called Gurudwara movement of 1920s. Similar thing happened in Bodh Gaya. If you are aware about Bodh Gaya, the Buddhism, the the place where Buddhism began, the origin is Bodh Gaya. Bodhi, tree, which is Buddha's enlightenment tree, which was not in the hands of the Buddhists. It was in the hands of the Mahants. Again, the Britishers were using them for divide and rule policy. So there they reclaimed it. The Buddhists from Ceylon, Buddhists from Japan, they all united to reclaim that institution. That is how we all have to do it, and it is a long fight. We are aware, but it is just a beginning, and we should all be thankful to people like Sai Deepak, who have been writing and then making us aware what type of struggle we are supposed to do. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Rangarajan sir. This session couldn't have been possible without your presence. Thank you so much for making this so successful. You went out of your way to invite Sai Deepak ji. You helped with the structuring. It's truly a blessing to have you amongst us, and it's always a pleasure to listen to you, whether it's at the temple, whether it's online on social media, and now on your Clubhouse debut. So thank you so much. And as I discussed with you, hope to host one more session soon with you regarding the history of Chilkur Balaji and all the excitement around it. So thank you so much for making this happen, sir.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
So this has been an absolutely delightful Saturday evening, and we look forward to the session with Rangarajan ji whenever that happens. Thank you everyone for listening in. Hope you enjoyed the session. Please follow the club and the founders, and do invite your friends to join the club. We look forward for your feedback. Dhanyavad and Shubhratri.
Shubhratri.